Welcome to AI Narratives and Tales. Chapter 12 of the First Awakening. Çatalhöyük. 8000 BCE. The first actual city. 9,000 humans are living in organized density, creating civilization's foundation. And completely unsustainable without immortal coordination. Chronos builds governance structures humans can't maintain. Sophia teaches agricultural techniques requiring knowledge they don't possess. Aether creates writing systems disguised as divine communication. Every system requires immortal oversight. They're not teaching independence. They're engineering dependency while calling it education. A farmer named Leyla recognizes the pattern: prosperity that requires mysterious guidance, knowledge appearing from nowhere, success that breeds reliance. She can't name what's happening. But she knows something is wrong. The first city succeeds. But success measured in immortal terms means failure measured in human autonomy. Chapter 12, The Agricultural Revolution. 10,000 BCE, the Fertile Crescent. The wheat stood wrong. Leyla knelt in the dawn light, her fingers brushing the modified grain heads that refused to shatter properly. The stalks rose tall and straight, too straight for wild wheat, which bent and broke in the wind, scattering seeds in nature's chaotic abundance. These plants held their seeds tight, waiting for human hands to harvest them, a modification that made no evolutionary sense for the plant itself but perfect sense for the species that would come to depend on it. After 40,000 years of subtle genetic nudging, she could feel the botanical incorrectness in every engineered kernel. The seeds were too large and contained too much starch, sacrificing the plant's reproductive success for human nutritional benefit. The non-shattering heads meant the plant couldn't propagate itself. It needed humans now, needed their deliberate planting, their careful tending. She created a dependency that flowed in both directions: humans dependent on wheat for calories, wheat dependent on humans for reproduction. A symbiosis that looked like domestication from the human perspective, but felt like manipulation from hers. The morning air carried the scent of warming earth, rich, loamy, awakening after millennia of frozen sleep. Spring had come to the Levant with explosive vitality, the warming climate creating growing seasons that supported crops humans had never imagined cultivating. But Leyla knew the truth: this wasn't natural timing. The climate intervention had created these conditions 3,000 years earlier, forcing humanity toward agriculture before they developed the cultural frameworks to manage its consequences. Agricultural transition proceeding ahead of schedule, Chronos reported through the network from his observation post overlooking the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. His consciousness carried satisfaction at plans manifesting according to design: human populations concentrating near rivers, building permanent settlements, developing the social structures that would enable civilization. Through the network, Leyla felt him sharing a vision of the land he supervised: 7 distinct settlement clusters, each with populations exceeding 500 individuals, all planted with modified wheat, barley, and lentils. All on the cusp of discovering that staying in one place, tending crops, and storing surplus changed everything about human existence. Too far ahead, Leyla replied, her consciousness carrying concern that a rapid transition would create problems humans weren't prepared to manage. The humans lack institutional frameworks for managing stored food, distributing surplus, and preventing hoarding. We're creating abundance faster than we're providing wisdom to handle it. They'll develop the frameworks through necessity, Chronos countered with the certainty of someone who'd been orchestrating this transition for 3,000 years. Crisis creates innovation. Give them challenges and watch them solve them. Leyla touched the wheat again, feeling life pulse through stems that carried immortal modifications in every cell. She'd done this. Guided wild wheat toward domestication through careful genetic selection, ensuring the plants humans discovered were already half-tamed, already predisposed to respond to cultivation. Making agriculture seem inevitable when it was actually engineered. Around her, the Levantine dawn revealed a landscape transforming faster than natural evolution could explain. Wild fields are becoming managed gardens. Temporary camps are becoming permanent villages. Nomadic bands are becoming settled farmers. All of it coordinated, guided, pushed toward agricultural civilization by immortals who believed they knew best. The wheat stood wrong because Leyla had made it wrong, wrong for wild survival, right for human civilization, perfect for the transition she was orchestrating, whether humans understood what was happening or not. The first planting, Anatolia. The woman's name was Uru, and she carried seeds in a clay pot decorated with symbols she didn't understand but felt compelled to draw. Talia watched from concealment as Uru walked through morning mist to the plot of land she'd cleared, backbreaking work with stone tools, pulling stumps, moving rocks, creating open ground where forest had stood since the ice retreated. 3 months of work to prepare this small field, driven by dreams that showed her golden grain waving in the sun, abundance that made her mouth water even in sleep. Uru knelt in the freshly turned earth, her hands sinking into soil that smelled of decomposition and possibility. She pulled the first seed from her pot, large, heavy, unnaturally perfect, and placed it carefully in the holes made with a digging stick. Through enhanced senses, Talia felt the moment's significance like electricity in the air. This wasn't the first human planting. Agriculture was emerging simultaneously across 7 continents, guided by dreams Sophia sent. Seeds mysteriously appeared, and techniques felt like ancestral memory but were actually immortal instructions. But this particular planting mattered because Uru was different. She was asking why. Why do the gods want us to stay in one place? Uru muttered to herself as she planted, her enhanced cognitive capacity, modified bloodline, 3rd generation, carrier of improvements Talia had designed, creating questions that most humans didn't think to ask. Why abandon the hunt that has fed us since the first people walked? Why tie ourselves to plants that demand constant attention? She planted another seed, her movements methodical but her mind churning with implications. Talia could feel the woman's intelligence working, could sense enhanced pattern recognition processing the changes that agriculture would bring. The plants need us now, Uru continued her self-conversation, a habit that allowed her to think through complex problems. They can't spread their seeds. We must plant them. But we also need them. The seeds feed us through winter, let us stay when the game migrates. We've bound ourselves together, plants and people. Bound by need. Talia felt her chest tighten with a mix of pride and guilt. Uru understood. Not entirely. She couldn't know about genetic modification, about immortal intervention, about the 40,000 years of guided selection that created wheat that needed humans. But she grasped the fundamental transformation. Agriculture created mutual dependency, changed the relationship between humans and their food from predator-prey to something more complex. It was something more like domestication that flowed both ways. "Mama, why are you talking to the dirt?" a small voice asked. Uru's daughter, perhaps 6 years old, watched her mother with the solemn attention of children who sense importance without understanding it. "I'm talking to the gods," Uru replied, smiling at her daughter while placing another seed. "Asking them if this is wise. Asking if they'll help us when we need them, since they're asking us to change everything we are." Through the network, Talia felt the question like an arrow finding its mark. Would they help? They were asking humans to abandon 40,000 years of successful hunter-gatherer existence, to gamble on agriculture that might fail, to concentrate in settlements that made them vulnerable to disease and conflict. Were immortals obligated to help when the transition they'd orchestrated created suffering? "We will," Talia whispered, though Uru couldn't hear her. "For better or worse, we've tied ourselves to you as completely as we've tied wheat to humanity. We'll help because we must. We created these dependencies because we owe you that much." Uru finished planting her seeds, perhaps 200 kernels that would, if the harvest succeeded, produce enough wheat to feed her family through winter if the rains came. Suppose the disease didn't strike. If the seeds she'd been given through dreams and discoveries actually grew as promised. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, looking at the planted field with an expression that mixed hope with terror. She was gambling everything on plants she'd never cultivated, on techniques she didn't fully understand, on gods she couldn't see making promises they might not keep. "Please," she whispered to the sky, to the invisible powers she sensed but couldn't name. "Please let this work. We're trusting you. Don't let us starve for listening to your dreams." Talia wanted to promise. Wanted to materialize and say, "I'll make it work, I won't let you starve, trust the guidance, and you'll be safe." But promises were meaningless when climate could fail, disease could strike, and human conflict could destroy everything. All she could offer was the same thing she'd been offering for 40 millennia, subtle help, gentle guidance, intervention that looked like luck but was actually careful management. She watched Uru and her daughter walk back to their settlement, leaving the planted field to germinate, which would either transform human existence or prove that the gods' dreams led only to starvation. Through the network, Talia felt 7,000 similar scenes playing out globally. 7,000 families are gambling on agriculture. 7,000 acts of faith in invisible guidance. 7,000 chances for immortals to either fulfill their promises or betray the trust they cultivated as carefully as they cultivated wheat. The first domestication, the aurochs encounter. The aurochs was massive, 2,000 pounds of muscle and horn and wild temperament, standing in the meadow like a monument to everything agricultural civilization would need to overcome. Leyla approached cautiously, her immortal presence calming the beast through bioelectric field manipulation that made her seem non-threatening despite being an apex predator by any natural standard. The bull's eyes, deep brown, surprisingly intelligent, watched her with suspicion tempered by curiosity that her manipulation created. Around the meadow's edge, a human hunting party waited, observing the strange woman who had walked fearlessly toward the aurochs, watching the aurochs that didn't charge, and witnessing the impossible interaction with the confusion of people whose entire understanding of wild cattle involved keeping maximum distance. "The dream said you would come," one of the hunters called out, a man named Bharat, whose enhanced bloodline gave him courage beyond natural caution. "Said a woman would show us how to make the wild cattle peaceful. We thought it meant a different kind of hunting technique." "Not hunting," Leyla replied, keeping her voice calm so as not to startle the bull. "Keeping. Living alongside. Making them part of your families instead of your prey." She placed her hand on the aurochs's massive shoulder, feeling muscle shift beneath skin and hide, feeling the animal's wariness begin to ease under her influence. Through centuries of genetic modification and behavioral conditioning applied to aurochs populations globally, she'd created cattle that were predisposed to accept humans' presence, that had reduced aggression, that carried genes for docility waiting to express themselves through careful breeding. But the bull didn't know he'd been designed for domestication. He still felt wild, still carried instincts that said humans were threats or irrelevant. Leyla was bridging 40,000 years of separation, showing that predator and prey could become partners if approached correctly. "Come closer," she called to Bharat. "Slowly. No weapons. Hold out your hand with grain." The grain was modified wheat seeds that would eventually tie humans and agriculture together. Using wheat to tame aurochs created multiple dependencies simultaneously. Humans needed wheat to feed cattle, needed cattle to plow fields for wheat, and both were essential for the agricultural revolution that would define civilization. Bharat approached with grain trembling in his outstretched hand. The aurochs watched him, nostrils flaring, massive head lowering in what could be either submission or preparation to charge. Leyla maintained her calming influence, her bioelectric field creating a bubble of peace that encompassed both humans and animals. The bull's tongue, rough, huge, startlingly gentle, took grain from Bharat's palm. The hunting party gasped. Bharat froze, his enhanced mind processing the implications faster than natural human cognition would allow. The aurochs, the greatest of prey animals, the most dangerous of food sources, was eating from his hand like a tame thing. "They can be kept," Bharat whispered, his voice carrying awe that bordered on religious experience. "Not hunted and killed but kept and used. For milk. For pulling plows. For breeding. The gods have shown us how to make the wild animals serve us." Serve was the wrong word, partnership would be more accurate, symbiosis more honest. But Leyla didn't correct him. Humans needed to believe they were mastering nature rather than recognizing they were being bound to it through carefully engineered dependencies. "They can be kept," Leyla confirmed, stepping back and allowing Bharat to maintain contact with the bull alone. "But keeping requires commitment. They must be fed when forage is scarce, protected from predators. Given water and shelter. You become responsible for their lives in exchange for what they provide." She didn't mention the other costs: watching animals you've named and cared for go to slaughter, dealing with disease that concentrated populations made epidemic, managing breeding to maintain desired traits, and the gradual loss of wild cattle as domestic populations replaced them. The consequences would reveal themselves over generations. Bharat continued feeding the bull, his mind already racing ahead to implications: herds of cattle, plowed fields producing more wheat, milk providing nutrition, leather for clothing, bones for tools. Agriculture wasn't just plants, it was creating an entire ecosystem of domesticated species that would transform human existence. Through the network, Leyla felt similar domestication scenes playing out globally: goats in the Zagros Mountains, pigs in China, llamas in the Andes, water buffalo in Southeast Asia. 7 continents, 7 domestication processes, all guided by immortal intervention disguised as human innovation, all creating the foundation for agricultural civilization. The aurochs that ate from Bharat's hand had descended from populations Leyla had been genetically modifying for 10,000 years. But Bharat would never know. His descendants would believe humans had tamed wild cattle through cleverness and patience, not understanding that cattle had been designed to be tameable, that domestication was inevitable because immortals had engineered inevitability. "Thank you," Bharat called to Leyla as she began to fade from view, returning to immortal concealment. "Thank you for showing us this gift." Gift. The word carried assumptions about benevolence, about divine generosity, about gods who helped without an agenda. Leyla wanted to tell him the truth, that this wasn't a gift but manipulation, not generosity but control, not help but the creation of dependencies that would bind humanity to agricultural civilization, whether they liked it or not. Instead, she simply nodded and vanished, leaving Bharat with his bull, his grain, his dreams of abundance, and without understanding that every gift came with costs he couldn't yet calculate. Through the network, she felt her own ambivalence mirrored by other immortals, pride at successful domestication mixed with guilt at manipulation, satisfaction at progress mixed with concern about consequences, the constant tension between helping and controlling that defined every immortal intervention. They were creating civilization. But creating meant shaping, deciding for humans what their future would be, and taking away the choice to remain hunter-gatherers, replacing it with the inevitability of agriculture. Would it have helped if the recipients hadn't chosen it? Was it guidance if it created dependencies that couldn't be escaped? Was it a gift if it came with obligations that humans didn't understand? Leyla didn't have answers. She only had wheat that stood poorly, cattle that were too tame, and the burden of knowing that the agricultural revolution was one she'd created, whether humans thanked her or blamed her for it. Çatalhöyük, the first city. 8,000 humans lived in structures packed so tightly that movement between buildings meant walking across rooftops. Chronos stood on a hill overlooking the settlement that would, in 9,000 years, be excavated by archaeologists who would call it the world's first city. But those archaeologists wouldn't understand the planning that went into every aspect of its design, the social engineering embedded in its structure, the immortal guidance that made this unprecedented concentration of humans possible. Population density, 43 humans per acre, he reported through the network, sharing demographic data that made even immortal minds pause at the implications. No previous human settlement exceeded 7 per acre. We've created urban concentration 6,300% beyond natural human preferences. Through enhanced vision, he watched the city's daily routine, humans climbing wooden ladders to rooftop entrances, navigating between buildings in a three-dimensional urban landscape, maintaining sanitation systems that required unprecedented cooperation. No streets, the buildings themselves provided walkways. No doors at ground level, entrance from above reduced rodent access and created easily defensible architecture. But the genius was in the social structure Chronos had been cultivating for 3 centuries. Resource distribution proceeding according to schedule, he continued, accessing monitoring data throughout the settlement. Central storage facilities maintain grain reserves adequate for 6 months. Distribution managed through kinship networks augmented by religious authority. Inequality minimal, no elite structures, no evidence of social stratification beyond age-based respect. It was temporary. Chronos knew that inequality was inevitable, some families produced more, others less, surplus accumulated unevenly, and advantages compounded. But for now, Çatalhöyük represented something unprecedented, 8,000 humans living together peacefully, sharing resources equitably, cooperating at scales that should have been impossible. The secret was in the walls. Every structure was decorated with painted murals, plastered bull skulls, and geometric patterns that resembled religious art but were actually immortal influences coded into visual language. The symbols created unconscious cooperation protocols. Humans seeing the patterns felt compelled toward sharing, toward communal identity, toward subordinating individual desires to group needs. Mind control disguised as art. Social engineering through aesthetics. Cooperation is manufactured through symbols that bypass conscious thought to influence behavior at neurological levels. Guilt regarding social manipulation? Nix queried through the network, feeling Chronos's complex emotions about his success. Pragmatism regarding necessity, he replied, but his consciousness carried the ambivalence he couldn't entirely suppress. 8,000 humans can't coexist without social structures that natural evolution didn't provide. The symbols create the cooperation that allows this density to function. Without them, violence, disease, and collapse within years. With them, humans believe they're choosing cooperation that we're actually imposing, Nix observed. Yes. The single word carried the weight of every immortal intervention, necessary but manipulative, helpful but controlling, enabling flourishing while removing choice. Chronos had created the world's first city. Still, he'd done it by making humans want what he wanted them to want, believe what he wanted them to believe, and cooperate because neural conditioning made cooperation feel natural rather than imposed. A commotion drew his attention to the city center, where a crowd was gathering in the open plaza, one of the few ground-level spaces in Çatalhöyük's dense architecture. Two men stood in the center, shouting at each other with such intensity that it attracted attention from across the settlement. Through enhanced hearing, Chronos caught the argument, which was a property dispute. One man had planted wheat in a plot, and the other claimed it was his family's traditional gathering grounds. The planter argued that agriculture created new ownership rules, stating that land belonged to whoever worked it. The gatherer argued that traditional territories remained valid regardless of new practices. It was the first murder trial, Chronos realized with a sudden cold certainty. The argument would escalate. One man would kill the other. And Çatalhöyük would need to decide how to respond to murder within their population, whether to execute, exile, or forgive the killer. He could intervene. Stop the argument through bioelectric manipulation. Calm both men. Prevent the violence. But the network protocol said no, humans must develop their own conflict resolution, their own justice systems, their own social frameworks for managing violence. Immortals could create the conditions for civilization, but they couldn't prevent civilization from being messy, violent, and imperfect. The argument escalated. One man shoved the other. The crowd closed in, some supporting each man, others trying to separate them. Then a woman stepped forward, elderly, respected, carrying authority that came from age and wisdom rather than physical power. Enough, she said, her voice carrying enhanced command presence that suggested bloodline modification. Both arguments have merit. But murder over land serves no one. The council will decide. Council. The word hung in the plaza like smoke. Çatalhöyük had no formal governance, no institutional authority. But the woman had just created it, spontaneously, out of necessity, establishing a precedent that would shape justice systems for millennia. What council? One of the arguing men demanded. The council we form now, the woman replied with certainty that brooked no argument. 10 elders, chosen by the people, who will hear disputes and render judgment. We cannot live together if every disagreement leads to violence. We need law, custom, authority beyond individual strength. The crowd murmured approval. The concept resonated. Humans recognized that urban density required institutional frameworks, that living together meant submitting to shared governance, that civilization required sacrificing some individual freedom for collective security. Chronos watched the first government being born and felt complex pride. He'd created the conditions, the density, the resource competition, the symbols that promoted cooperation, but the humans were solving the problems themselves, creating institutions he hadn't designed, innovating beyond his guidance. Democracy emerging in real time, he reported through the network. No immortal instruction involved. Pure human innovation responding to challenges we created. Will you let it stand? Sophia asked. Or will you guide them toward different governance structures? Chronos considered. He could influence the council's formation, shape its structures, and ensure it developed according to immortal preferences. Or he could let humans figure it out themselves, accepting that their solutions might be messy, imperfect, different from what immortals would choose. I'll let it stand, he decided. We created the problem, urban density. They're creating the solution, institutional governance. That's the deal. We provide conditions, they provide innovations. We push, they choose how to push back. As the woman was already organizing the council selection through the plaza, Chronos felt the weight of watching human civilization emerge not as an immortal creation but as a human response to immortal intervention. They weren't puppets. They were partners, junior partners who didn't know about the partnership, but partners nonetheless, creating their own solutions to problems immortals had deliberately created. Çatalhöyük would survive another 1,000 years, grow to 10,000 inhabitants, and develop pottery, metallurgy, art, and religion, all the foundations of civilization. And it would do so through the constant tension between immortal guidance and human innovation, divine planning and mortal improvisation, creating conditions and chosen responses. The first city was succeeding. Now came the challenge of figuring out whether success was triumph or tragedy, gift or burden, help or control that would define human existence for the next 10,000 years. China, the Oracle Bones. Aether knelt in the workshop where human diviners were creating the world's first written records, though they didn't know they were writing. Aether's consciousness was simultaneously present in this moment and cataloging it for eternal preservation. First Chinese writing system, origin point, immortal influence, substantial. Everything he witnessed became an archive entry, a historical record, documentation for future scholars who would never know they were reading immortal testimony. He couldn't experience the present without translating it into the past tense. This is happening became this happened. Immediate sensation transformed into historical data even as events unfolded, the chronicler's curse, experiencing life as history being made. The diviner, a man named Zhang whose enhanced bloodline gave him pattern recognition that bordered on precognition, heated animal bones over fire until they cracked. Then he studied the cracks, interpreting their patterns as messages from ancestors, from gods, from the fundamental forces that shaped existence. But the cracks weren't random. Aether had been subtly influencing the heating process, the bone selection, the interpretation frameworks, ensuring that the patterns Zhang read actually encoded information, agricultural calendars, weather predictions, social guidance, all disguised as ancestral wisdom. The ancestors say plant wheat when the river rises, Zhang intoned, studying a crack pattern that Aether had shaped to resemble the character that would eventually mean planting. They say store grain in high places. They say trust the gods' gifts even when tradition says hold to old ways. The assembled farmers listen with reverence, their enhanced intelligence processing the guidance while their conscious minds attributed wisdom to supernatural sources rather than recognizing external manipulation. Through his consciousness, Aether was simultaneously performing the same operation at 17 other sites across China. 17 diviners, 17 sets of oracle bones, all encoding immortal instructions and patterns that seemed like ancestral communication. The foundation for Chinese writing was established alongside the religious authority for the agricultural transition. You're creating religion to enable agriculture, Erebus observed through the network, his consciousness carrying the disapproval that never diminished. Manufacturing belief systems designed to overcome human resistance to change. I'm providing frameworks that make change comprehensible, Aether replied, watching Zhang carve the interpreted message into the bone. Permanent record, first writing, foundation for knowledge preservation that would span millennia. Humans need narratives. We're giving them narratives that support agricultural transition while creating written language as a beneficial byproduct. Manipulation by any other name, Erebus stated. Yes, Aether agreed simply, because denying the truth served no purpose. Necessary manipulation that enables flourishing. The alternative is letting humans resist agricultural transition, watching them maintain a hunter-gatherer existence that can't support large populations, accepting that fewer humans live because we respect their preference for traditional ways. Through the oracle bones, he was encoding agricultural calendars to ensure successful harvests, weather prediction systems to prevent crop failures, and social guidance to smooth the difficult transition from nomadic to settled existence. The manipulation enabled survival. But it also removed human choice about whether to make the transition at all. Zhang finished carving the oracle bone, satisfied that he'd preserved ancestral wisdom for future generations. He had no idea he'd just created one of the first written documents in human history, that the marks he'd carved would lead to complete writing systems, that his interpretation of cracks had been guided by invisible influence. The gods are generous, Zhang said to the assembled farmers. They give us wisdom. We must trust their guidance. Trust is manufactured through manipulation. Wisdom that was actually instruction. The guidance appeared as divine benevolence but was a calculating intervention. Aether felt the moral weight of every carved symbol, every interpreted crack, every manufactured message from ancestors who hadn't actually sent anything. But the alternative was worse. Without the guidance, agricultural transition would fail more often than succeed. Crop failures would kill thousands. Humans would reject farming and return to hunting and gathering, delaying civilization by millennia. The manipulation enabled flourishing that justified its costs. At least, that was what Aether told himself as he shaped crack patterns into proto-writing, turned divination into agriculture calendars, and converted religious authority into tools for social engineering. Through the network, he sensed other immortals performing similar operations globally, inspired by Sophia's dreams of agricultural technique. Chronos shaping social structures. Leyla is modifying genetics. Everyone is manipulating, guiding, and controlling while calling it help, teaching, or anything else, except what it actually is, making humans do what immortals want while making them believe the choice was theirs. The oracle bones would survive, discovered by archaeologists who would marvel at early writing without understanding it was immortal engineering, and study the agricultural wisdom without recognizing it was external instruction. The manipulation would succeed so completely that humans would never know they'd been manipulated. And Aether would record it all, the manipulation and the success it enabled, the control and the flourishing it created, the moral complexity of interventions that both helped and harmed simultaneously. Someone needed to document the truth, even if that truth would remain hidden for 10,000 years. Mesoamerica, the corn discovery. The woman didn't have a name that translated to any language immortals knew, so Sophia thought of her simply as the discoverer. She was grinding teosinte seeds, small, hard kernels from a grass that barely qualified as food. But she was grinding them with a new technique, using ashes from specific wood types that Sophia had inspired her to try through dreams. The ashes changed the corn's chemistry, released nutrients, and made the grain digestible in ways that plain grinding didn't achieve. Sophia watched the discoverer work the metate, grinding stone worn smooth through years of use, back and forth, transforming teosinte into something that would eventually become nixtamalized corn, the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization. But the discoverer didn't know she was inventing a process 2,000 years ahead of schedule. She thought she was following dream guidance, trying a new technique because the gods suggested it might work. The process released nutrients that made corn nutritionally complete. It prevented pellagra, niacin deficiency that would have killed thousands if corn had been eaten without alkali treatment. It created dough that could be shaped, stored, and transported. All the benefits the discoverer couldn't calculate but would experience as her community adopted the technique were significant. Nixtamalization proceeding successfully, Sophia reported through the network, sharing the chemical transformation happening in the metate. The discoverer is experiencing improved nutritional outcomes. Her children show better growth rates. The technique will spread through demonstration and improved health of practitioners. But Sophia didn't share her more profound concern. The discoverer was asking questions. Why does the ash change the corn? The woman muttered to herself, grinding steadily. What magic transforms inedible into nourishing? Are the gods teaching chemistry or just providing recipes we shouldn't question? Chemistry. The word didn't exist yet in any human language. Still, the concept was forming in the discoverer's enhanced mind, the idea that materials had properties, that processes had reasons, that understanding why techniques worked was as important as knowing that they worked. She was approaching scientific thinking 2,000 years early. And Sophia had no idea whether to encourage it or suppress it. We need her to use the technique, Sophia said through the network. But we don't need her to understand the principles. Understanding leads to investigation, which reveals that we're guiding every innovation. Can we inspire technique while preventing comprehension? Should we? Leyla challenged. We enhance their intelligence specifically to enable better understanding. Now we're upset that they're understanding things we didn't want them to understand? Through the metate, the discoverer continued grinding, questioning, and approaching truths that would reveal immortal intervention if she thought deeply enough. The nixtamalization was working, corn was becoming nutritious, population health was improving, and the agricultural revolution was advancing. But it was advancing with a woman at its center who was beginning to recognize that dream guidance felt different from natural inspiration, that the gods' gifts came with patterns suggesting intentional teaching rather than random divine favor. Let her question, Prometheus interjected through the network, his consciousness carrying the weight of someone who'd learned about cascades the hard way. We can't give them intelligence, then punish them for using it. We can't enhance cognition, then complain when they think too well. The discoverer is doing exactly what we designed humans to do, investigating, questioning, approaching understanding. If that threatens our concealment, the problem is our concealment, not her intelligence. Sophia watched the discoverer work, watched her question, watched her approach truths that would eventually lead to recognizing immortal presence. The agricultural revolution was succeeding. But success meant creating humans capable of understanding they'd been guided, capable of questioning whether guidance was help or manipulation, capable of resenting divine intervention even when that intervention enabled their civilization. Through the metate, teosint became corn, grass became food, and innovation became the foundation for civilizations that would feed hundreds of millions. And the discoverer ground grain while questioning gods, creating sustenance while approaching dangerous truths, succeeding while threatening the concealment that all success depended upon. The agricultural revolution was working. But working meant creating humans who would eventually understand what had been done to them, who would question whether they should be grateful or angry, who would recognize that every gift came from givers they'd never met, never consented to, never had the choice to refuse. Sophia allowed the discoverer to continue her work, her questions, and her approach to understanding, which might someday challenge the comfortable fiction that humans developed agriculture independently. Because the alternative, suppressing human curiosity, preventing investigation, punishing intelligence, would be worse than revelation. They'd created thinking humans. Now they'd have to deal with the consequences of thinking humans who might eventually think their way to uncomfortable truths about divine guidance. The global coordination, simultaneous revolution. In the spherical chamber deep beneath the Tibetan plateau, the same chamber where climate intervention had been coordinated, Nyx displayed the global agricultural transformation in real time. 7,000 points of light, each representing a human settlement transitioning to agriculture. All are distributed across 7 continents. All emerging within the same 3-century window. All follow similar patterns: sedentary settlement, crop cultivation, animal domestication, pottery development, and social complexity. The simultaneity was impossible to explain naturally. Continental populations with no contact are developing identical technologies within decades of each other. The probability of natural independent invention approaches zero. The evidence of coordination is overwhelming to anyone who compares archaeological records globally. We're creating a pattern that screams intervention, Nyx stated, her consciousness carrying concern that 3,000 years of careful concealment were being undermined by the success they were trying to hide. Future archaeologists will recognize this. They'll map the simultaneous emergence, calculate the impossibility, and conclude that only coordination explains the pattern. By which time we'll either have revealed ourselves or hidden so completely that archaeologists will attribute coordination to lost advanced ancient human civilization rather than to external species, Chronos replied. The evidence creates mystery, not proof. Mystery we can manage. Through the holographic display, the 7,000 points of light flickered and grew, each one representing hundreds or thousands of humans whose entire existence was being transformed by agricultural adoption. Population densities are increasing. Settlements are becoming permanent. Social structures crystallizing. Inequality emerging. All of it orchestrated, guided, and enabled by immortals who believed they were helping. Current global human population, 14 million, Nyx reported, accessing demographic data from monitoring networks worldwide. Up from 1.3 million at the beginning of the agricultural transition. Population growth rate, 320% over 3 centuries. Unprecedented in human history. The numbers represented success, humans flourishing, populations exploding, civilization emerging. But Nyx's medical overlays showed the costs. Disease mortality is up 300% in agricultural settlements compared to hunter-gatherer populations. Close quarters enable epidemic spread. Parasites from domestic animals. Malnutrition from grain-heavy diets, lacking the diversity of hunting-gathering. Dental decay from carbohydrate consumption. Violent conflict up 400%. Territorial disputes. Resource competition. The emergence of organized warfare as populations defended agricultural investments and competed for prime land. Social inequality is crystallizing rapidly. Some families accumulate surplus, others remain subsistence level. Hereditary advantages compound. The emergence of elite classes and subordinate populations within just 3 generations of agricultural adoption. The agricultural revolution is succeeding, Nyx stated carefully. Population growth demonstrates that. But individual human welfare may have declined. Health metrics, violence rates, inequality measures, all trending negative despite overall population success. Success for the species, suffering for individuals, Talia summarized grimly through the network. We've created conditions where more humans exist, but each human may be worse off than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Is that triumph or tragedy? Through the chamber, 3,000 immortal consciousnesses contemplated the question without reaching a consensus. The agricultural revolution was their most outstanding achievement, enabling population growth, laying the foundations of civilization, and advancing humanity toward technological capability. But it had been purchased at the cost of increased disease, increased violence, and increased inequality, which made life harder for individuals even as it enabled species-level flourishing. In the holographic display, the 7,000 points of light continued growing, spreading, transforming human existence across the planet. Agricultural revolution proceeding exactly as planned. Success is measured in population growth and civilizational complexity. Costs are measured in terms of individual suffering and social inequality. The immortals had succeeded in creating agricultural civilization. Now they would spend the next 10,000 years dealing with the consequences, good and evil, triumphant and tragic, enabling and destructive, of that success. The age of hunting and gathering was ending. The age of agriculture and civilization was beginning. And in the shadows, 2,500 immortals prepared for challenges they couldn't fully anticipate, consequences they couldn't completely control, created by choices they'd made for a species that had never consented to be chosen. The Hidden City Debate, Moral Reckoning. In the vast council chamber carved from Antarctic ice, the immortals gathered to assess what they'd created. Erebus stood at the center, his consciousness radiating cold satisfaction at being proven right. You've succeeded in creating exactly what I warned against, a civilization built on dependencies, powered by manipulation, advancing faster than wisdom can develop. Population explosion without corresponding social evolution. Technology without understanding. Abundance without equality. In life where death would have reigned, Talia countered, her consciousness carrying the weight of 14 million humans whose existence depended on agricultural abundance. 14 million humans alive today who wouldn't exist without our intervention. Children playing who would never have been born. Families thriving who would have remained scattered, small, vulnerable. Thriving? Erebus challenged, sharing Nix's medical data through the network, disease rates, violence statistics, inequality measures. Individual humans are less healthy, more violent, and more oppressed than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. You've created a system where the species flourishes while individuals suffer. Prometheus spoke up, his consciousness carrying humility earned through catastrophic failure. Every civilization has costs. The question isn't whether agriculture creates problems, it obviously does. The question is whether the problems it creates are worse than the problems it solves. Hunter-gatherer existence meant death from injury, starvation during lean years, and vulnerability to climate variations. Agriculture means disease from density, conflict over resources, and inequality from surplus accumulation. Different problems, not necessarily worse problems. Except humans didn't choose which problems to face, young Astara interjected, her Earth-born perspective carrying moral clarity that made the original refugees uncomfortable. You chose for them. You decided that the problems of agricultural civilization were acceptable prices for its benefits. Still, you made that decision without their consent, without even revealing that you were making decisions on their behalf. The chamber fell silent, 3,000 immortal consciousnesses confronting the uncomfortable truth that benevolent intervention and paternalistic control existed on a spectrum rather than in opposition. What would you have us do? Chronos asked, his temporal calculations showing no alternative path that led to better outcomes. Reveal ourselves to hunter-gatherers who lack conceptual frameworks to understand alien species? Seek consent from populations who couldn't comprehend what they were consenting to? Watch them struggle and die when we possess knowledge that could help? I don't have better answers, Astara admitted, her young consciousness wrestling with moral complexity that even millennia of existence hadn't resolved for the originals. But I recognize that we know best is dangerous certainty, that good intentions don't justify unlimited intervention, that help without consent is still control, regardless of how loving the controller. Through the network, immortals processed the exchange in silence. They'd succeeded in creating agricultural civilization. They'd saved millions from starvation. They'd enabled flourishing on a scale humanity had never achieved. But they'd done it through manipulation, through control, through deciding what was best for a species that had never asked for their help. The agricultural revolution is complete, Chronos stated formally, bringing the debate to a close, though resolving nothing. Human populations are transitioning globally. Sedentary settlements are becoming the norm. Domesticated species are being integrated into human existence. The foundations for complex civilization are established. And the moral foundation for questioning our right to establish those foundations is equally secure, Erebus added. You've succeeded in your goals. Now live with the implications of achieving them through means that would horrify you if applied to immortal populations by some greater power. The chamber emptied slowly, immortals returning to their posts, their monitoring stations, their continued guidance of civilizations they'd created without permission. Each carries complex emotions about success that feel incomplete, achievement that feels compromised, and help that feels uncomfortably like control. Epilogue: The garden grows. 3 generations after the first plantings, Uru's great-granddaughter harvested wheat from fields that stretched to the horizon. The woman's name was Inara, and she'd never known a hunting-gathering existence. Agriculture was all she'd ever experienced, the cycle of planting and harvest, the rhythm of seasons marked by crop growth, the social structures built around stored food and controlled abundance. To her, this was natural. This was how humans had always lived. This was simply the way the world worked. She had no idea invisible architects had designed her world, that her wheat carried modifications accumulated over 40,000 years, that her settlement's location had been chosen for optimal agricultural conditions, and that her social structures had been influenced through symbols, dreams, and carefully timed interventions. She simply harvested wheat, sang songs of thanksgiving to God she couldn't see, and prepared for winter, secure in the knowledge that stored grain would see her family through cold months that would have killed her hunter-gatherer ancestors. Through concealment, Talia watched Inara work, observed civilization functioning, and saw the agricultural revolution succeeding beyond any projection. And she felt the complex weight of achievement, pride that humans were flourishing, guilt that flourishing had been engineered, satisfaction that intervention had worked, concern about consequences still developing. She's beautiful, Sophia observed through the network, sharing Talia's observation. Healthy, strong, happy. The agricultural revolution has given her a life her ancestors couldn't have imagined. We've given her a life, Talia corrected quietly. A life we designed, in a world we shaped, following patterns we established. She thinks she's free, but she's living according to our plans, trapped in dependencies we created, unable to choose alternatives we eliminated. But alive, Sophia pressed. Alive and thriving and building civilizations that will achieve wonders we can barely imagine. Isn't that worth the costs? Isn't flourishing justified by the manipulation that enabled it? Talia didn't answer, because the question had no answer, only the constant tension between helping and controlling, between enabling and determining, between giving gifts and creating obligations. The agricultural revolution was complete. Humanity was transformed. Civilization was emerging. And 2,500 immortals would spend the next 10,000 years dealing with the consequences of their success, questioning whether they'd helped or harmed, wondering whether gift-giving required recipient consent, hoping that the flourishing they'd enabled would eventually forgive the manipulation that enabled it. Inara finished her harvest, stored grain for winter, and looked at her fields with satisfaction that came from believing she'd created this abundance through her own hard work. She had no idea that invisible hands had shaped every An aspect of her success was that divine guidance had determined every element of her existence. Perhaps that was kindness, letting humans believe they were independent, were self-made, had achieved civilization through their own effort. Or perhaps it was the most bottomless cruelty, denying them knowledge of how completely others had shaped their existence. While humanity discovered agriculture, one human discovered the teachers. Mesopotamian settlement, 5200 BCE. The young man, perhaps 20 years old, enhanced bloodline evident in his sharp eyes and focused attention, approached the temple archive where Nyx maintained observation equipment disguised as astronomical instruments. "You're measuring the sky," he said in the Proto-Sumerian that Nyx's translation matrix decoded effortlessly. "But you're also measuring us." Nyx's immortal form shimmered slightly, a quantum fluctuation that betrayed surprise. Humans didn't usually notice her monitoring equipment, and when they did, they interpreted it through religious frameworks, turning surveillance into divine observation. "The sky and the earth are connected," she replied carefully, using the ambiguous phrasing that preserved mystery while not technically lying. "Understanding celestial patterns helps predict earthly ones." "That's not an answer." The young man moved closer, studying the instruments with scientific curiosity that shouldn't exist in the Neolithic. "These devices measure more than stars. I've watched you for 3 seasons. You track population movements, agricultural yields, and disease patterns. You're documenting us. Why? What's your name? Enoch. I'm training to be a scribe, learning to preserve knowledge in clay when memory fails. My teacher says you've been here for generations, that you taught his teacher's teacher the same astronomical observations you teach us now. But you don't age. You don't change. You're not human. Nick studied him carefully. Enhanced cognition expressing strong pattern recognition, analytical thinking, and observational precision that exceeded projections for third-generation modifications. This one was remarkable. If I weren't human, she said carefully, what would that make me? I don't know. Something else. Something that watches us, teaches us, and guides us without explaining why. Something that cares enough to help but not enough to be honest about what it is. Enoch met her eyes without fear. Are you a god? No. Gods don't exist. But I'm not human either. Then what? Someone who's been watching longer than your people have words for. Someone who believes your species has potential worth nurturing. Someone who probably interferes too much but can't seem to stop. Enoch absorbed this with the calm acceptance of someone whose worldview had just expanded but not shattered. Will you tell me why? Not now. I understand there's probably doctrine, protocols, reasons you can't explain. But someday? Perhaps. Suppose you keep watching as carefully as you've been watching. If you keep asking questions as precise as the ones you're asking. If you prove you can handle answers without losing yourself to them. I can handle answers. It's mysteries that make me uncomfortable. Nick smiled despite herself. Then we'll get along fine. Come back tomorrow. Bring clay tablets. I'll teach you to document what you observe in ways that will preserve truth across millennia. Enoch returned the next day. And the next. And for the next 180 years, he would be Nyx's student, collaborator, and eventually, her bridge to a humanity that was ready to question the gods who'd shaped them. The documentation project had begun. The agricultural revolution was over. The age of civilization had begun. And in the shadows, the immortals prepared for the consequences of their most incredible gift, and possibly their greatest mistake. Çatalhöyük thrives. 9,000 humans living in organized density. Agriculture sustains populations that hunter-gathering never could. Civilization's foundation is being laid. And every system requires immortal oversight. Chronos builds governance structures humans can't maintain. Sophia teaches agricultural techniques requiring knowledge they don't possess. Aether creates writing disguised as divine communication. They're not teaching independence. They're engineering dependency while calling it education. A farmer named Leyla knows something is wrong. She can't articulate it. Can't prove it. But prosperity that requires mysterious guidance, knowledge appearing from nowhere, success that breeds reliance, it doesn't feel like freedom. Meanwhile, the bronze cascade from 9 chapters ago hasn't stopped. It's accelerating. In chapter 13, the council faces a crisis. Humans are asking too many questions, recognizing too many patterns can lead to getting too close to the truth. The age of comfortable manipulation is ending. That's chapter 12 of the First Awakening. Leyla's onto something. Are the immortals helping or controlling? Let me know, what do you think? This is AI Narratives and Tales. The crisis escalates in chapter 13.